thank you for coming today, and it's wonderful to be back in Columbia, back in South Carolina, and wonderful to be here with these incredibly courageous women, as well as a few guys, who are here to talk about a pretty serious subject, and it's something that is near and dear to my heart. I was in law enforcement before I got to the U.S. Senate, and saw the scourge of gun violence in my community, and actually got involved back then in trying to push for some gun safety measures. And then when I got to the Senate, I thought, okay, well now we can get some of these things done. And as Roberta, who's here with me, knows so well, because of the loss of her son Nate, that it isn't just about mass shootings. It's also about day-to-day crime. And in fact, the numbers are that we lose at least a classroom of kids every week to crime. And I had a lot of those cases. She was telling me how Nate got shot on the front porch. We had a little kid who was younger than your son named Byron Phillips, who was also sitting on the front porch and was killed. And for years we didn't know who did it, and we were put up billboards and things like that showing his face. And we got that case done. There was another little girl we had named Taisha Edwards, who was just doing her homework at the kitchen table, and the bullet went through her window and she died. And so those kinds of cases are actually how I got involved in all of this. And there's a combination of answers to this, as we know, including investing in neighborhoods and education, prosecution, where you make sure you're convicting the guilty but protecting the innocent, making sure the guns don't get into the hands of people that shouldn't have them, and that we enforce those laws, like felon in possession of guns. And I've done all that, but I also know there's other solutions. And one of those solutions is to get some of these guns off the street. So when I got to the Senate, I come from a state just like South Carolina that has a strong hunting tradition. We are really proud of our hunting that we do in our state. We don't quite have the ducks that you guys have, but we've got deer hunting, which I know you have in South Carolina, and we also have pheasant hunting and some duck hunting. So whenever I look at these proposals, when I got to the Senate, I always thought about the people in my state, and I say to myself, does this hurt my Uncle Dick in the deer stand? And I think you could say about the same about a duck blind in South Carolina. And I don't think these common sense proposals that we have worked on for years do that by any means. And one of the things that we have found that's new in these last few weeks is we're starting to see more and more support for these common sense measures from hunters and from people in rural areas and in red states. There was just a Fox News poll that came out today showing very strong support for some of these common sense measures from Trump voters. I suggest you look at that poll. And so I see this as a moment in time. Of course, sadly, coming out of those tragedies in Dayton and in El Paso. And when you think about the extraordinary courage of those ordinary people, the mom, and I bet you wish you could have done this for your son, the mom that shielded her baby in that Walmart, and she ends up dying, but the baby survives, or the veteran that got people out of that store, or the police officers, both in Philadelphia just recently, as well as in Dayton. In Dayton, they showed up in 1 minute. They were there in 1 minute. They did everything they possibly could and got that guy. But in the first 30 seconds, he killed 9 people in 30 seconds. That's what happened. And I think when Americans look at that situation, they just say, no, this is over the top. We should not have high-capacity magazines and guns like that out on our streets and being sold on our streets. So what's happened in Washington? Well, first of all, we had a moment after Sandy Hook, and that's when we really got all these moms involved and people across the country. And we had this moment where we had that universal background check bill that came before the U.S. Senate. It was sponsored by 2 A-rated NRA senators. That would be Senator Toomey, a Republican, and Senator Manchin, a Democrat. And those moms were in my office, moms and dads, that were the parents of the kids that got killed in Sandy Hook that morning. It is still my saddest day in the Senate. And they were sitting there, and we had to tell them that we didn't have the votes to pass that bill. And I still remember this mom telling me, she said, you know what, my son, he was really autistic, severely autistic, and he couldn't really talk very well. So every morning he would point at when he was going to school, he pointed at the picture of the school aide that was with him all day. And that day of the shooting, he did the same thing. He points up at that picture. And then he goes to school, and she never saw him alive again. The next thing she knows, we're at the fire station, and one by one, those kids are coming into that fire station, and after hours go by, the parents that are left know they're never going to see their kids alive again. And as she's sitting there sobbing, she thinks of her son, but she has this momentary flash where she thinks of the school aide. Because she said to me, she said, you know, I knew she would never leave his side. And when they found them, shot dead, that woman, that school aide, had her arms around that little boy. That's courage of ordinary citizens. And I think we have to have the courage in Washington to match the courage of the people up here with me today, to match the courage of those police officers that show up in 1 minute to the scene, because we've got extraordinary power in Washington, but what's been lacking is courage. The change that I saw after the groundwork was laid with a number of groups, including Moms Demand Action and others, was after Parkland. And I think part of it was kids that spoke out. And those kids became icons. And other kids across the country started talking to their parents, to their dads, and to their grandpas, and said, look, you know, we hunt in our family, it's important, but I don't understand why we can't have the background checks, or we can't have the waiting period. You think of what happened here in South Carolina with Charleston, with that church, and the fact that this white supremacist was able to get in there and get a gun simply because what we call the Charleston loophole, of course, 3 days has passed and he was automatically able to get a gun. All of those stories combined to get people in this country looking at it in a different way. So what happened in the 2018 election is that we saw a change. We saw people elected across the country, including in some red districts, right? Including in South Carolina, who got to Congress and looked at this in a different way. I had 2 people got elected in my state in the same way. People got elected in Iowa. People got elected in districts that had been held by people that were just basically doing the NRA's bidding. And that changed things. And that is why we passed these 3 bills. So remember, there are 3 bills. There is the uniform background check bill, universal background checks that would allow to make sure we've got adequate background checks that pass the House. There is the waiting period bill that closes that Charleston loophole. And then there is my bill, which is called the boyfriend loophole, which actually makes it sound nicer than it is, because in reality it's a really bad thing. Right now, if someone is convicted of serious domestic abuse, they can't go out and get an AK-47 if they've abused their wife or their husband. It's mostly wives. But the law doesn't allow if it's a girlfriend. So in other words, if you are convicted of the same crime against a girlfriend, you can go out and get an assault weapon. It makes no sense when about half of the domestic homicides involve people who are in dating relationships. And we had a hearing on this, actually, a while ago, and this conservative sheriff, who identified himself as a conservative Republican from Racine County, Wisconsin, he said, dangerous boyfriends can be just as scary as dangerous husbands. They hit just as hard, and they fire their guns with the same deadly force. And that also, in that bill, includes stalking for stalkers who've been convicted of stalking. And when you look at a lot of these mass shootings, there's this common thread through about half of them where they actually kill a woman in their life, whether it is a sister, as happened in Dayton, or whether it is a girlfriend or a wife. And so this kind of is a thread that goes through these cases and why closing this loophole will be so important. So those are the three bills, and they are sitting on Mitch McConnell's doorstep right now. I know that Senator Graham announced in the last few days that he was getting on the bill with Senator Blumenthal on the red flag law. I think that is one of the solutions that we should look at here. I do not think it is the only solution, but it's important. And when you rewind the tape back from the meeting at the White House with the president after Parkland, I was the one sitting across from the president who asked about universal background checks and this closing the boyfriend loophole, and I counted 9 times he said that he wanted to get the universal background check. I actually took hashtags and wrote down how many times he said it. I also asked about the red flag laws because the vice president was sitting next to me and I knew they had that in Indiana. Again, the president was open to that. And then the next day he met with the NRA and he folded. And so that is why I think that we cannot let this go this time. I have a feeling that sometimes in the White House they think, well, public opinion will ebb. No one's going to care about this in a month, and then maybe we won't get this done. The reason that I'm going to areas that are redder to talk about this, like Little Rock yesterday, is because there has been a sea change, and we need to keep the pressure on so we keep the pressure on when we get back to Washington. And I'm glad that Senator Graham is taking a leadership with this red flag law, and I've been a long time a supporter of that, but we need to do more, and that includes the universal background check bills and some of the other things that the women standing around me have worked on. It's never one size fits all. We were talking earlier about your loss and suicide. The thing that could really help with suicides is the universal background check bills, as well as some of the red flag laws and other things. Because a lot of times people who commit suicide make a spontaneous decision to go out and get a gun. They often buy it on the market, and those kinds of waiting periods and those kinds of universal background checks would make a big difference. So we just need to match the courage of the people in this country so we can get this done. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I don't know if you want to add anything. Roberta, about your work and the loss of your son. I don't know if you all know the story. He was going to get his hair cut sitting on a porch and got gunned down at age 21. Yes. And Roberta's taking her grief, as horrible as it is, as are many people up here with me, and putting it into action. I want to thank her for that.
You're welcome. Yes. Okay. Yes, my son, my only son at the age of 21, Nate Daniel McKelvin III, and I'm Nate's mom. He was shot and killed November 15, 2013, in his community sitting on the porch by a classmate. Senseless gun violence. He was a good boy and smart, intelligent. He had just got his CDL license. His dad had to go pick his truck up that Sunday. He was shot and killed that Friday. And it's senseless. I am his voice, and I am Nate. I stand for Nate, and I want to save lives. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. Thank you. Questions?
My name is Perry Bradley. I'm with Building Better Communities, and I'm just glad to be here because we need to really address the gun violence in our communities. Mass shootings are important, but Columbia alone has seen an 88% increase in gun violence. So our job is really just to try to bring awareness and solutions, hopefully, for anyone coming through politically that wants to do anything to help us, to come out and let's try to work together. I think together we'll be able to fix this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Any questions?
Questions? That's good. I hit on everything.
I just had a quick question. You mentioned Senator Graham and working with Senator Blumenthal on his red flag legislation. We've spoken to state legislators here in South Carolina, and asking them if something like that would spur them to do something on the state level. And there have been a lot of concerns about due process and whether this would infringe on Second Amendment rights. Your thoughts on that and what might happen in the Senate?
You know, I go back to some of the U.S. Supreme Court cases, including ones on the guns with the conservative court that we have right now. And they actually wrote into the decision that they think that you could allow for reasonable safety rules. It's right there in the decision. They were basically saying, hey, you know, bring them on. We think you can put some reasonable safety rules in place. And that's what we all think are things like red flag laws. It's already been found legal in a number of states, including the Vice President's own state of Indiana. They have it. So I am not as concerned about that, and I hope that the legislators and others look at the fact that there are more conservative states that have the red flag laws. But again, I also believe strongly that these other things we're talking about, the red flag laws alone is not going to fix this. And it will include, if you really want to look at it, because all these things are different, right? The universal background checks, the Charleston loophole, the closing the boyfriend loophole, looking at magazine limits. And I know that the Republican congressman from Dayton, Ohio, from that district, after he saw the carnage in his own district, came out for the military-style assault weapon ban as well as for the limits on magazines. So, you know, there are a number of things, and we've just got to take this on as a nation, and we have to come to grips with it, especially in hunting states with a lot of rural areas, and they've been being told a lot of things that just aren't right and aren't supported by the facts. And I think that's one of them when it comes to those red flag laws. Okay? All right. That's it. Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. You did great. Okay.